Ever since the Libertines entered our consciousness, they've been constantly categorised with the Strokes, and were heralded by the likes of the NME as the British version of the New York band. However, until recently we've not really had too much insight into what they actually think of each other. Here's an early interview with the Libertines in which Pete Doherty explains the effect the Strokes had on them.
I suppose in the back of our minds we thought one day we might get a record deal or have our own instruments and stuff. And then when we seen the Strokes, it was almost like proof that you can still... They seem to be authentic, the music seems to be genuine and like strong songs. So they were like an example, like you can still do it, and they look like they were mates and they're enjoying it, and it was just cool, you know, it seemed natural. So it's proof that you could still do it, you could still get away with it, you know, just stick together, keep going. So it was, in a way, it was not influential, maybe on the way it happened for other people and why they chose to like us even, you know, but more inspirational than influential, I think, yeah. Like when the Strokes first came along, our manager, like, she was supposed to be our manager, but we hadn't seen her for 6 months. And all of a sudden, Strokes came along, and she brightened up pretty sharpish.
Yeah, she did.
Because she thought, oh, I know some boys who dress.
She smelt with you, Bob, I reckon.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah, in terms of inspiration, then
you didn't even like them.
No, that's because
I was saying, oh, there's this wicked band, you got to hear them, and they heard it, and you went, that's rubbish.
Yeah, no, because it sounded like badly recorded Velvet Underground, and that's saying something. It's Velvet Underground, you know, worst recorded band in history, but it's a great effect.
So Carl was maybe not as enamoured with them as Pete and the band manager Banny, and you get a sense of that in Doherty's book A Likely Lad, when he explains, "This is when Banny came back on the scene. She was saying, I can get you a deal with Rough Trade if you sound like this and look like this. It became known as Plan A. What was the plan? Get the best looking people and be as much like the Strokes as possible. That's how it was. It was definitely Banny's vision, but actually had been my plan all along. So, get the best looking boys and be as much like the Strokes as possible? Great idea. I was well up for that, if it worked. I thought the Strokes were brilliant. I was still working on a building site when I first saw a picture of them. There was a little article in Dazed and Confused. All I could see was me, Carl, Scarborough Steve and John. Even one of them was wearing the same t-shirt Steve had been wearing for years. I was thinking, how dare they? And on first hearing them on an AGP, Doherty says, I'd never heard anything like it. It sounded like the better quality rehearsals that we'd had when Steve was on drums. It sounded like a band having a good time in a room, and the lyrics were amazing. Doherty then references Mare Reid and Tabitha of Queens of Noise, and the indie club night that they used to run. I remember Mare Reid putting on Hard to Explain, the lead single from the Strokes' debut album, and me and Francesca going mad, jumping on tables and sofas, thinking this is it, this is our anthem, and the whole world was going to get swept away with it. But no one else was getting it at all. No one else was having it apart from Mare Reid, who was going mental behind the record decks. I ended up crashing at her gaff in Dalston and I wrote up the bracket there. She became one of the Libertines family. So it's interesting there that not everyone in that Libertines group was massively getting into the Strokes, but it seems they were undeniably the catalyst for the band getting signed. Doherty then talks about the first time he saw the Strokes live in London. Tickets were supposed to be like gold dust for the Strokes' debut London show at Heaven in late June 2001. To us, the gig was really something. Even though the sound at Heaven was a bit swampy and the crowd was just one big swaying mob rather than people going ballistic, we jumped the train and followed them to Liverpool where they played the next day. It was that gig, which was full of groups of Lad and Reebok classics as well as loads of rock and roll kids all having it, that I thought, yeah, maybe it can still happen. You can still ignite something. Maybe there can still be another great band. We tried to get a lift back to London with the Strokes on their tour bus. They spotted us getting into trouble with their road crew, trying to nick their guitar pedals from the side of the stage. These Australian guys nearly battered me senseless. One of the Strokes came over and said, leave him alone. He's got a cool suit on. And that's how we got into their dressing room. I remember being really annoyed there was no music playing and thought, if I ever have a dressing room, I'm going to have a record player in it, playing the Ronettes or something. We explained to them that we'd jumped the train from London and didn't have any money. At that point, they were sort of half entertaining the idea of giving us a ride back to London. They said, listen, we want to get some traditional English food, and we said we'd get some fish and chips for them. They pulled out this wad of money. Will this be enough? They gave us a couple of 50s. Yeah, that'll do nicely. We disappeared with the money, and by the time we got back, they were all piling in their bus with these exotic-looking twins. I thought, we're not getting on that bus, and Mare Reid was gutted. They just swished past us and moved on. In the book Meet Me in the Bathroom, Nick Valenti talks about the first time he met the Libertines, not knowing who they were. He says, the previous time we'd been in England, we went to these indie club nights in London. We were in the loudest club in the world, and there was this guy sitting in the corner of the club, and he was playing the acoustic guitar in this super loud club. He wanted to talk to me, show me songs he'd written, telling me he's starting a band. He was with this Italian girl. They were obviously together, but there was kind of insinuations of, well, maybe we'll all get together tonight, that kind of thing. He wanted to come back into my hotel with me, and I was like, nah man, I'm sorry, I have to go. I remember leaving thinking, that guy is crazy. I think the club was called Trash. So we went to England to do our second tour, and Jeff Travis from Rough Trade said, I have this great band, they're called the Libertines, and they're going to open for you. We got to the venue, the first gig of the tour, and who is the guy who's singing in this band but the crazy guy with the acoustic guitar from the night at the club? It was Pete Doherty. He remembered me very clearly. He knew who I was the first time I met him. Albert Hammond Jr. also comments on it, saying, I remember meeting Pete Doherty and Carl in Liverpool. They gave me some substances and tried to get on our tour bus. 6 months later, they had formed a band and were opening for us. Valencia then talks about the comparison between the bands, saying, I didn't think their music really sounded like us though. We're musically very precise, we have tight arrangements, whereas they're very loose. Pete and Carl certainly looked not that different from us. It's funny because in Doherty's book, he talks about the night Valencia is referring to, but has a slightly different take on it. He says, in fact, there was quite a bit of animosity between us and the Strokes. It started when we were all down at Trash to see the Yeah Yeah Yeahs. It was their first ever show in London and I was really out of my nut. Karen O came on stage with a can of lager and was tipping lager on the crowd. So I was grabbing random pints and chucking them back at her. I might have even got up on stage. I got flung out anyway, but I managed to get back in later with the guitar, and that was the last thing the Strokes wanted. They were sat around trying to pull, and I had this guitar out. Johnny Burrell was there too. It was a lock-in after Trash. Carl got the guitar and was trying to play Julian Casablancas his songs, and Julian said, why do you always want to play guitar, man? Put the guitar down. And Carl was really offended. In a book about the Strokes, Nick Valencia, their guitarist, remembers me from that night, and basically said I had these two dodgy birds with me, and that I was trying to get him back to a hotel with us. Nice story, but not how I remembered it. When it comes to Pete and Julian Casablancas, it sounds like they never really saw eye to eye, or broed out, as Julian put it in Meet Me in the Bathroom. When I spoke with Strokes producer Gordon Raphael, he explained that Julian was somewhat wary of Pete when they played a few shows together back in the day. Here's what he had to say. And then, yeah, you mentioned doing the sound for Libertines while they were playing with the Strokes, and there's just a funny story of how Pete asked you to introduce him to Julian, and then the next thing you saw he was leaving 10 minutes later.
Yes, leaving in a hurry 10 minutes later. And I never found out why that was either, but I got told by Julian, never bring him back here again. Okay.
Then Jeanette Lee of Rough Trade even says, Julian really did not take to Peter. His response was, who is that guy? Julian Casablancas then adds to this saying, I mean, we played shows with them, I think somewhere, Leeds or I can't remember where. I never really broed out with those guys. I put this quote to John Hassel of the Libertines when I spoke with him, and here's what he had to say.
Yeah, I don't really blame them, to be honest. It's not like, really, I mean, what's in it for them, really? I mean, at that point, obviously, like, it would be different if you're, a bit older person and interested in other things, but at that age, when you're kind of like, you just want to, be in a band and play music and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, the kid. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, they were. I think they were very kind of involved with what was going on for themselves, at that time. But yeah, we were all like a lot younger, right?
In reference to Julian Casablancas, Doherty says, Carl and Wolfman didn't rate him at all. Alan Wass came to one of their gigs and was just shouting in the middle of the crowd, Pete, you're better than this lot, and ended up having a big fight with the same Australian security guards who'd had a go at me in Liverpool that time. Julian said to me, why do you like to hang out with people who fight, man? I took that as a compliment. I remember Alan bending down into their faces backstage and going, are you from New York? He was being really obnoxious, so everyone got chucked out. Gordon Raphael also mentioned that for some reason, the Libertines chose not to use him as a producer for the first album. I can understand that move really, given how much they were compared to the Strokes, and maybe going as far to use the same producer was a bit close for comfort. But what do you think? Are there similarities between the bands, or is it just a case of one band inspiring another? Have your say in the comments.